Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into a book that's been making waves. Snakes in the Ganga, Breaking India 2.0.
Oh yeah, I've heard about this one.
By Rajiv Malhotra and Vijaya Viswanathan.
It's pretty provocative, right?
It is.
Yeah.
And it's gotten people talking, which is why we're here.
Makes sense. So what's the...
To take a deep dive and see what it's all about.
Gotcha. Yeah.
For our viewers who maybe haven't read it yet, could you give us the elevator pitch?
Well, the book basically argues that some Western ideas about social justice, with good intentions, when they're applied to India, they could actually be backfiring and causing more harm than good.
Okay, so it's about being careful with how we apply these ideas to different cultural contexts.
Exactly. It's like you can't just take a cookie cutter approach to social justice.
Gotcha. Now, the book specifically talks about critical race theory or CRT. Could you give our viewers a little explainer on what that is?
Sure. So CRT basically examines how racism is embedded in systems and institutions. It argues that racism isn't just about individual prejudice, but that it's built into the very fabric of society.
So like systemic racism.
Yeah, exactly. And that these systems, even if they don't seem explicitly racist, they still perpetuate racial inequality.
Okay, and how does this American theory, CRT, connect to India, according to the book?
So Snakes in the Ganga argues that CRT is being applied to India by equating caste with race. It's like they're creating a critical caste theory, if you will.
Interesting. So they're saying that there's this tendency to draw parallels between the experiences of Black Americans and Dalits in India.
Right, and they're suggesting that this comparison, while it might seem well-intentioned, could actually be oversimplifying a very complex issue.
Because they're saying that caste isn't the same as race.
Exactly. It's not a direct one-to-one mapping. Caste has its own long and intricate history in India.
So are the authors saying we shouldn't talk about caste-based discrimination at all?
No, not at all. They acknowledge it's a serious issue. But they're saying we need to be careful about imposing Western frameworks onto a different cultural context.
I see. So it's about nuance.
Precisely. And understanding the complexities.
Now, the book also mentions Oprah Winfrey's support of Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste.
Oh, right.
How does that fit into this whole discussion?
Well, Wilkerson's book argues that caste is the foundation of global racism. She compares India's caste system to racial hierarchies in the U.S. and Nazi Germany.
Wow.
Snakes in the Ganga pushes back on this view, arguing that it simplifies Indian society too much.
So they disagree with Wilkerson?
They do. They think she overlooks the unique factors that shaped India's social dynamics.
Gotcha. Now, one thing that really stood out to me was the book's focus on this Afro-Dalit movement. Could you tell our viewers a bit more about that?
Sure. So this movement has been gaining some traction, and it often mirrors tactics and terminology used by the Black American experience.
Oh, interesting.
Like, you see things like Dalit Lives Matter and Dalit Heritage Month emerging.
So are the authors against these movements?
Not necessarily. They're more concerned about framing Dalits solely as victims. While it's important to acknowledge their struggles, it could overshadow the progress made in addressing caste-based discrimination.
So it's about showing the whole picture.
Yeah. And avoiding what they call manufactured victimhood.
Manufactured victimhood. What do they mean by that?
Well, they argue that constantly focusing on victimhood might actually be counterproductive.
Oh, so?
They say it could fuel more social unrest and division within India rather than promoting healing.
So it's a delicate balance.
Definitely. And they're not saying that discrimination doesn't exist. It's more about finding constructive ways to address it.
That makes sense. Now, the book also points a finger at institutions, specifically Harvard University.
Oh, interesting.
For playing a role in promoting this kind of critical caste theory.
Okay.
Why Harvard? What's their argument there?
They claim that Harvard's a central hub for developing and promoting this framework through its research, academic publications, and activist networks.
So they're saying that these ideas are coming from within academia?
In a sense, yeah. And they're worried about Harvard's influence on Indian policymakers and thought leaders.
Because of the alumni network and stuff?
Exactly. And they contrast this with Harvard's approach to China, which they say has successfully leveraged Harvard's to further its interests.
Interesting. So they're saying that India is not being as strategic in its engagement with Harvard.
That's one way to look at it. They're also concerned about the funding behind some of these initiatives at Harvard.
Really? Like where the money's coming from?
Yeah. Snakes in the Ganga highlights the contributions of Indian billionaires to Harvard specifically for projects related to South Asia studies and social justice.
Okay, so they're saying Indian billionaires are funding research that could potentially be harmful to their own country.
That's a bold claim, right?
It is.
The book doesn't accuse anyone of intentionally trying to harm India, but it raises questions about the unintended consequences of this funding.
Like, even if their intentions are good.
Exactly. It's about being mindful of the potential impact, even when you're trying to do good.
That's a really important point. Now, I know we've only to scratch the surface here. There's so much more to unpack in Snakes in the Ganga.
Definitely a lot to think about.
So for our viewers who are finding this as fascinating as we are, we'll be continuing our deep dive in part 2 of this episode.
Just can't wait.
So don't go anywhere. Welcome back to our deep dive into Snakes in the Ganga. We're really getting into some thought-provoking stuff here.
Yeah, it's a dense book.
And I think it's important for our viewers to know we're not trying to tell anyone what to think.
Absolutely.
We're just exploring these ideas together.
Yeah.
Encouraging everyone to form their own opinions.
Critical thinking is key.
Yeah, exactly. Now, in the first part, we talk about how the book critiques the application of Western social justice frameworks to India, but it also delves into the historical evolution of these ideas, tracing them back to Marxism.
Yeah, that's a big part of their argument.
Could you unpack that a little bit for our viewers?
Sure. So the book spends a lot of time discussing how Marxist thought has transformed over time
Okay.
and how it's influenced contemporary social justice movements.
So, like, how has it changed?
Well, traditional Marxism focused on class struggle and economic inequality, right?
Right.
But critical race theory shifts the focus to race and identity.
As the main drivers of social injustice.
Exactly. It's like a shift from economic determinism to identity determinism, if you like.
Identity determinism. That's interesting. So they're saying that now it's all about your identity. That determines your place in society.
In a nutshell, yeah. And they argue that this shift has led to a kind of oppressor versus oppressed narrative.
Where everything is seen through that lens.
Exactly.
And how do they connect that back to India?
Well, they argue that this oppressor versus oppressed framework is being applied to India's caste system.
By saying that Brahmins are the oppressors and Dalits are the oppressed.
Right. And they're not denying that. Caste-based discrimination exists in India.
Right.
But they're saying it's not the same as racism in the West.
Because caste is more complex than just race.
Exactly. It's rooted in ancient traditions and beliefs.
So trying to force fit it into a Western framework
Yeah.
might not be the best approach.
Right. And they also point out that there's been a lot of progress in addressing caste-based discrimination in India.
So they're saying we need to acknowledge that progress too.
Absolutely. It's about seeing the whole picture.
Not just focusing on the negative.
Exactly.
Now, the book also brings up this distinction between equity and equality.
All right. Yeah, they spent a whole chapter on that.
Could you break that down for us?
Sure. So traditionally, we've talked about equality of opportunity.
Where everyone has a fair chance to succeed,
Right.
regardless of their background.
But the idea of equity focuses on equality of outcome.
So it's not enough to just give everyone a fair shot. You have to make sure everyone ends up in the same place.
That's the idea.
And the authors have a problem with that.
They do. They argue that this pursuit of equal outcomes can actually be harmful.
How so?
Well, they say it could lead to policies that undermine meritocracy and individual achievement.
Because you're not rewarding hard work or talent.
Right. And they argue that focusing solely on outcomes ignores the role of individual effort and circumstance.
So someone who works really hard and succeeds shouldn't be penalized to make things equal for others.
That's their argument. And they connect this back to critical race theory, saying that its emphasis on equity is part of a larger agenda to dismantle existing power structures.
Okay, so they're saying that even if those power structures are based on merit, they should be dismantled.
That's how they see it.
And they see that as a problem.
Yes, because they believe it could lead to a less just and less free society.
Now, we talked in the first part about those Indian billionaires funding initiatives at Harvard. Can we dig into that a little more?
Sure. So the book actually names names.
Like who?
People like Anand Mahindra, Lakshmi Mittal, the Piramal family, Azim Premji.
Wow, some big names there.
Yeah. And their donations have supported a range of programs at Harvard, particularly those related to South Asia.
And the authors are suggesting that some of this funding might be fueling this breaking India narrative.
That's their concern. They're worried that funding research that focuses mainly on the negative aspects of Indian society could create a skewed perception.
So, like, they're painting India in a bad light.
That's the worry. And they argued that it's important to also highlight the progress and positive aspects of Indian culture.
So it's about balance.
Yes, and they're encouraging philanthropists to be more mindful of the impact of their funding.
To make sure they're promoting a balanced view of India.
Precisely.
This is all really thought-provoking stuff.
It is, and there's still more to come.
We're going to wrap up our discussion of snakes in the Ganga in part 3, so make sure you stick around. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into snakes in the Ganga. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's one more piece that I really want to dig into.
Okay, what's that?
The book's argument about the role of institutions, like Harvard University.
Ah, yes, the Vishwaguru chapter.
Exactly. They use this term Vishwaguru, meaning world teacher, to describe Harvard's influence.
It's a powerful analogy.
It is. We often hear about India aspiring to be a Vishwaguru on the global stage.
Right.
But the author suggests that it's actually Harvard that's currently holding that position, at least in terms of influencing Indian thought leaders.
Especially on issues of social justice, yeah.
So they're like a reverse guru-shishya dynamic.
That's a great way to put it. Instead of India exporting its wisdom to the West is exporting its ideas to India.
And the authors aren't too happy about this, right?
Well, they use this term intellectual colonization, which is pretty strong language.
It is. What do they mean by that?
They're concerned that Western ideas are being adopted without enough critical thinking.
Like without considering whether they're actually appropriate for the Indian context.
Exactly. And they argue that this could be harmful to India's social fabric and national unity.
But haven't they also said that Harvard has been kind of digesting and repackaging aspects of Indian culture for Western audiences?
Yeah, they talk about that too, like with yoga and meditation.
So it's this weird contradiction where they're criticizing some Indian traditions while profiting off others.
It's a valid point. It raises questions about power dynamics and the ethics of cultural exchange.
It's almost like a double standard.
Right. The book seems to be advocating for a more balanced and respectful exchange of ideas.
One that recognizes the value of India's own traditions.
Exactly.
So what's the takeaway for our viewers? What can we learn from snakes in the Ganga, especially those of us in the West?
I think the biggest takeaway is the importance of cultural humility.
What do you mean by that?
It's about recognizing that our own perspectives are shaped by our own cultural backgrounds.
And being aware of that when we engage with other cultures.
Precisely. It's about approaching other cultures with openness and respect.
Seeking to understand rather than to judge.
Exactly. And recognizing that what works in one context might not work in another.
There's no one-size-fits-all solution to these complex issues.
Right. And being aware of our own biases.
Because those biases can shape how we see other cultures.
Absolutely.
Snakes in the Ganga really challenges us to think critically about these issues, not just for India, but globally.
It's a call to engage in genuine dialogue, to listen with empathy and be open to learning.
From those who have different experiences than our own.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, folks, we've reached the end of our deep dive into Snakes in the Ganga. It's a book that's sure to spark a lot of debate and discussion.
It definitely gets you thinking.
It does. And we hope this deep dive has given you some new insights and perspectives to consider. If you'd like to share your thoughts, leave a comment below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Book Reviews One for more explorations of fascinating books. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking.